very timely topic. I'll give you just a tiny bit about my background, and then we'll shortly after my presentation we'll hear from each of the panelists. But I've been following the healthcare IT sector since 1994. I graduated business school in '94 and got a job on Wall Street as a research analyst. And at that time, there were 4 publicly traded healthcare IT companies. I initiated coverage in all of them, and over the next 11 years of my career, there were 36 additional ones that went public. I personally took 11 of them public over that time frame. Had most of my career at Bear Stearns, and left Bear in '04 and became a banker. So I moved from the research side to the banking side in '06, where I joined Cain Brothers, which I've been at now for the last almost 5 years. We're a small boutique investment bank, strictly providing banking services to the healthcare industry, and I strictly bank the healthcare IT industry. And I think we were talking about it, myself and a few of the members just here before we got started. Again, the timeliness of this subject. I always joke that the first 6 or 7 years of following this industry, almost till roughly the year 2000, telling anybody I covered healthcare IT, meant nothing to anybody outside of people directly in the industry, and frankly, even people in healthcare had very little appreciation for the opportunity for IT and information technology broadly to transform healthcare. And we've clearly come a long way in the last decade, and I'd argue the study that the Institute of Medicine did in '99 that showed that 100,000 people die every year due to medication errors that are theoretically avoidable, and most of that could be fixed due to better information flow, was sort of the start of what's been a fun 10-year ride. And I think we're in the early stages of a lot of development, still way behind the rest of industrial America in terms of the adoption of IT and what it can do. But I think a lot of the people on the panel are some of the leaders taking us to that next generation. So I'm excited to hear what they have to say. With that as a framework, I thought I'd just give a real short presentation to sort of set the groundwork for what I've seen in the last 15 years, where the industry's come from, where it is today, and sort of where I think the opportunities are. And I think this will play into a lot of the background and topics of our panelists. I like to start with a picture, and this is a picture I got literally a year ago. So it's not like this is a 15-year-old picture from a proud chief information officer of a mid-sized hospital system on the East Coast. I won't say anything more to identify the guilty party, but basically this was his quote-unquote streamlined IT infrastructure at his hospital. And this is a typical example of every hospital in America. In fact, I quote on the slide that the typical hospital in America has 30 to 40 different IT platforms from 30 to 40 different vendors. I've heard studies suggesting that number is actually north of 100. So every individual department in the hospital over the years has gone out and bought a Cerner system for the lab, an Eclipse system for the pharmacy, an HBOC system for the radiology department, because each of those business unit managers bought whatever product fit their business needs best, and no one ever really thought about how does all this connect. And one of the jokes in the industry for many years was all these departmental folks with bodily systems creating a spaghetti diagram. They would turn over to the chief information officer and say, now you have to figure out how to connect all this stuff. And one of the jokes in the industry is that CIO stands for career is over. Because if you were the person charged with trying to integrate this stuff, you probably weren't going to get it done. And I'll talk about in a moment how we've come a very long way, literally just in the last 5 or so years, towards creating standards and other things to enable better interoperability, which to me is sort of the starting point of almost everything we're going to talk about tonight. Because if we don't have data that we can integrate from all the disparate sources in healthcare, ultimately we can't accomplish a lot of the things we want to do. And as a frame of reference, people, and I probably have heard this over 100 times, people come out of the banking industry and say to me, oh, I was there when Visa started in 1985 or whatever, and we went from 0 to 80% penetration in 10 years, and everybody buys everything with credit cards today. I'm going to do the same thing in healthcare. This is my slide, and the next slide to those people to say it's not as easy. Healthcare isn't as easy. If you think about the healthcare industry, I showed you the spaghetti diagram within the 4 walls of a hospital, but from a practical matter, your medical data exists in many different silos throughout a community. And God forbid you've moved, it could be in multiple communities across multiple geographies. There's never been a mechanism or an initiative to say, how do we put all Ray Fauci's medical history in one place so you can track everything that's relevant to me, so if I get hit by a bus while I'm on vacation in California, they know that I'm a diabetic, that I'm allergic to penicillin or whatever else might be relevant. Whereas in the banking industry, you have many, central, standard-making groups that monitor all that. Now, this next slide is a little busy. I won't sort of read everything, but this gets at many of the parameters that, sort of exist in the banking industry that, again, historically did not exist in healthcare, and that we've come a long way in terms of improving. And I think the key takeaways here are standards like HL7, DICOM for images, frankly, HIPAA created a lot of teeth around how we manage confidentiality and privacy, have created a framework to make it more feasible to have IT-based medical data transfer. We also have had different models to track consumers. A non-trivial challenge, particularly here in New York, I hear, and I'm sure everywhere, is a large percentage of the population that admits to hospitals don't have social security numbers. So how do you just track a patient so that that's John Smith's data from the lab, from the pharmacy, and from the radiology department, so that you can integrate it all? And different almost artificial intelligence-based methodologies have been created to do some of that, where, again, that was almost a trivial thing for the banking industry. It's been a challenge, but we've made a lot of progress. And then, I think the final point of this page, we have things like RIOs, or now health information exchanges. So we have, actual business models and companies that are fully focused on integrating all the different members of the local healthcare ecosystem. So they're trying to create the ability to have my doctor, my primary care doctor, my cardiologist, my orthopedist, and then ultimately the physician who admits me to the hospital, all somehow be able to share my medical data, which obviously has a real practical benefit. So I'd like to talk about, we sort of have a perfect storm going on right now, and obviously, I'm feeling like I'm in a good place in terms of being a banker to this industry. I think everybody in this panel is sort of dedicating their career to this industry at this stage, and I think the time has sort of come. From a technology standpoint, we've had obviously tremendous advancements in cost and capability of technology to make a lot of the capabilities more feasible and more cost effective that, frankly, we didn't have 5 or 10 years ago. And in an industry that obviously doesn't have a lot of excess margin to spare on investment, and that's pretty critical. I think the healthcare industry, beyond the cost dynamic of cost spiraling out of control, when I talk to hospital CIOs and CFOs and CEOs now, they're more focused on how can I deliver care more effectively, more efficiently. And if you think about the, getting at the government box on the bottom of the slide, to me, one of the most notable advances, everybody talks about the stimulus bill last year, the ARRA stimulus bill that threw about $36 billion to stimulate investment in IT by providers. I frankly think some of the things in the reform legislation, particularly around accountable care organizations, where basically they're telling hospitals, you've got to prepare for the old fee-for-service model to go out the window. And your reimbursement is ultimately going to be based on cost and quality, managing risk, doing sort of preventive and wellness type management of members. And ultimately, to me, that's going to be the key to keeping healthcare from going from 18% to 25% of GDP. We'll probably still get close to that number, but somehow curtailing it, we need to make providers have more of a mindset of being more engaged in that. And I think we've taken a lot of steps in just the last several years to drive in that direction. Getting right to the topic of tonight's panel, though, thinking about how do you target consumers, because candidly, this is a little bit of a newer sub-segment of the healthcare IT world for me. I guess years ago was involved in the WebMD IPO, and dare I say, drcoop.com was another company I took public back in the late 90s, and a few others. But in those days, we were early, and it was tough to figure out how consumers were going to get involved in managing their health and getting involved. I think today there's all kinds of drivers that are making a lot of these initiatives more feasible. The first thing I look at as an investment banker is who pays. So if you're going to create a cool technology, I can't tell you how many business plans I get every day. Cool technologies, and the punchline is we'll figure out who pays for it later. Let's just get it to market and get it adopted, whatever. And usually those are the ones that go to the bottom of the stack, and I sort of move on to the next opportunity. But if you think about it, there's a lot of change going on in the healthcare industry. So health payers, which is probably the biggest client base of Kane Brothers, my firm, we right now have 12 different Blue Cross plans that have us engaged to do some kind of strategic work. And if I can boil it all down to a common thread among all 12 of these clients, they're all saying, I need to reinvent myself. I can't be, the plan of the old world was, I just negotiated with doctors and physicians to beat them up to lower their rates. I collected a premium from the employer and I made a VIG in the middle, and that's my business model. That's not going to be sustainable in the future world of healthcare. So most of the plans are saying, I need to figure out how to show that I'm providing more value to the actual management of the patient's health, of the member's health, particularly on the wellness side, and then to the extent they, God forbid, become ill, whether it's a chronic disease or an acute disease, I need to be providing more value into optimizing the treatment protocols and the methodology of that care. And so they are very incented to get more engaged with consumers to be able to manage their health in a better way. The pharma companies have always had a big focus on compliance, and I would argue today even more so than ever, because frankly they have less new products coming out of their pipeline. So if you're the brand manager at Pfizer, you're looking to squeeze every last dollar out of whatever product you have. Lipitor's a bad example because that's going off patent in 12 months. But whatever product it is, you're looking to squeeze every last dollar. And working with applications, there's many really cool companies out there that have, internet-based and other type applications to, on a daily basis remind the consumer to take his or her med, check up on them, and just stay in front of them. Pharma companies will pay a lot of money. Obviously, it's another pill that they sell, or it's an avoided sale if the consumer misses that day. And ultimately, because it was prescribed, the assumption is it's also good for his or her health, and that's why it was prescribed in the first place. Again, the ACO model, I've been stunned how quickly hospital management teams have really focused on this. For me, as a big picture sort of guy, I would argue, let's see if Obama gets reelected in 2 years and see if healthcare reform stays as passed before I would start building a strategy as a hospital executive on any element of healthcare reform that doesn't take effect until the next presidential election cycle. That said, to my earlier point, they're saying I need to address it now, because whether or not parts of healthcare reform get repealed, we could debate that. The concept of providers being more accountable for the cost and quality of the care they deliver, and not being in a fee-for-service, just do more units of whatever and get paid for it. They recognize that old model is going to need to go away, and it's a whole new skill set. And if people in the room were around in the late '90s when physicians grappled with capitation, that was our first taste at what the ACO model is going to be. And physicians got crushed because they were given fixed per member per month fees to cover a population of members. They had no clue, and I talked to so many docs in those years. You had no clue. It sounded like a big number. I'm getting $600 per member per month to manage this patient, and all of a sudden you find out, guess what? They have diabetes, congestive heart failure, and bad hip, and they're going to need a hip implant. There's no way you're making money at $600 per member per month on that member. And so the hospitals are very focused on how to measure and manage that risk, being able to monitor. And I think that's going to make them very much more consumer focused, and it's been a direction they've been trending toward anyway. And then obviously with the consumer picking up a bigger piece of the healthcare tab, they have more skin in the game. My firm, Kane Brothers, we have an HSA, a health savings account, so I'm very motivated to look at what I spend on every dollar of healthcare, because what I don't spend stays in my bank account, in my HSA bank account, and I can save it for next year, when God forbid, something happens to my wife or my kids or myself. So, what will people pay for? I talked about compliance and improving outcomes. I think, one of the holy grails has been getting the data to validate the protocols. Evidence-based medicine has become a big focal point, and frankly, you need to put all this infrastructure in place first to enable that. And then something called transitions of care has become a big focus, which refers to following a patient across every provider that he or she sees throughout the healthcare continuum, and making sure you can seamlessly, pass all their information around. And finally, contextual content is an important thing. So I think, sort of wrapping up my prepared remarks, I think among the areas people are really looking to spend money, clearly chronic diseases is where most healthcare dollars are spent. I think a lot of the opportunities we're going to talk about tonight will relate to being able to monitor chronic diseases with mobile technologies. Non-chronic diseases like depression and sleep disorders, I've seen a lot of pretty interesting business models that have some cool technologies, along those areas. And then, following up with members and then, just sort of maintaining a contact with them to maintain their health and wellness status is something that's ultimately going to drive a lot of cost out of the system. And again, a lot of the technologies we're going to talk about tonight will enable that. I close by saying, again, getting back to who pays, a lot of these business models you got to focus on, is there a reimbursement angle to the technology or not? And if not, who pays? And that becomes another critical element of thinking about, of how I evaluate business models. So with that, what I thought would make sense is we move on to our panel. And what I thought I'd do is I have a question for each of our panel members, based on their specific backgrounds. I'll ask them to, give a little bit of their background, who they are, their organization, and then address the question, and we can go to the panel. And I'd invite people to be sort of interactive. If you have any questions, we'll make this pretty as interactive as we can. So I was going to open up with a question to Nick. You've been following the space for a while, and your company's done some pretty progressive things, specifically around medical transcription, and obviously you've been around the EMR space for a while. I'd love to have you talk about the challenges and opportunities in applying technology to actually impact the delivery of healthcare, and in that context, how critical is the incorporation of patient-specific monitoring to get clinical information to drive some of these solutions? How do you all think about that?
Okay, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? I'm not sure whether the microphone's on. Is that okay for everybody? So, great introduction, and with some relevance to my background from 1993, when I was part of a team that built a paperless hospital for patients being treated coming from the Middle East over to the US, and we were trying to disintermediate that in the United Kingdom. And what was interesting about that was we created a paperless model, but everybody around us didn't have a paperless model. And to the point earlier on, that interface between the two environments was a failure from our perspective, because what we received in was paper and what we sent out was paper. So whilst we were paperless inside, we didn't have the interfaces, and that really underlies the sort of fundamental principle of being able to share information effectively. The other thing that we discovered as part of that process was workflow was an essential component to this. And step back to 1993, and we were building rooms that didn't even have a position for a screen or a monitor, and we were trying to build that into the space that was already very confined for the interaction with patients. Step forward to 2010, and my daughter goes into the local pediatrician's office, and they have an EMR, and it's a wireless tablet, and I, as a technologist, is very excited about this, and we left. And I asked her at the end of this, I said, "What did you think?" She said, "Well, it was great, but I wish the doctor had spent as much time with me as he had with the PC that was focused of the consultation." So workflow became an integral part. To the original question that you asked, this sort of technology and the implications of mobile technology, I pulled this out not because it's a headset, but really to give you an indication of health. If you imagine this as your health, it's a constant line, and when you go and see a physician, all you're doing is seeing a small portion of that activity. And even when we monitor you in hospital, it's still only a small piece of it. So the idea that we're actually capturing even a small part of the information that's relevant to that whole model of preventative maintenance and managing care really seems quite preposterous at this point in time, because we know that there's so much more going on that we don't actually track. I'll give you one clinical example of that. Sudden cardiac death is the cause of approximately 325,000 deaths per year in the United States alone. And in almost 50% of cases, that is the presenting complaint or condition for people with chronic cardiac disease. And in almost all of those cases, if we had monitored the patient on a continuous basis, we would have seen some kind of arrhythmia that would have given us an indication and some opportunity to prevent as part of that process. And I was struck as I walked to these offices past Brookstone that I can buy a $20 device that will fit over my finger to monitor my pulse on an ongoing basis. So we have technology that allows us, and the mobility of that and the constant tracking, I think, is a fundamental component of that. And then finally, integrating patients into all of this and providing them with a tool set in that mobile platform that is easy to use. And obviously coming from a company that delivers speech recognition and tools to allow that interaction as easy as possible, it's great to have a small mobile device, but mostly that screen and interaction is too difficult. So we very much believe that speech will become a key part of that activity and the interaction that will occur between both the patient as well as the physician and the technology. It will become a key aspect. And while sometimes that's not appropriate, as we've seen with text messaging in many instances, and I'm sure you all have children that text message more than they talk on the phone, in many cases in healthcare, interacting with voice is a much easier process with the complexity of the language and the interpretive aspects of that.
Great, thanks. To Rob now. Rob, in your bio, you mentioned having personal interests around areas related to social marketing, mobile health, social responsible brands. I'd love to hear how, if at all, that influences your sort of evaluation of opportunities and your sort of day-to-day work life as you look at the landscape out there.
That never does do my personal interests influence my work life, just as a general rule, just to get that out of the way. If they did, I'd be in a lot of trouble, I think. It's actually a really simple answer for those of you that don't know what Omnicom is. It's a large holding company of communications firms. What does that mean relative to healthcare? That's where I've been working for 10 years. I'm largely responsible for most of the healthcare things that go on there. Our business is not, like my fellow panelists, a business of connecting data or connecting like your spaghetti diagram, the seemingly impossible. It's actually a lot easier than that. Our business is about helping people understand information. And increasingly, that's the problem. And all of our development, internally in terms of how we communicate, externally in terms of technology we're on the hunt for, is all about the intersection, really, of content, purpose, and technology to aid in more consistent understanding. There's too much information. FDA's been having hearings on just people misunderstanding prescribing information. So that's step one. And then you multiply it by the myriad of what's out there, combined with really the patient's desire, to Nick's point, not to just have more information, but please, can I really just spend more time with my doctor? So just kind of wrapping it all together on your question, my personal interests have to do with just a fascination in how social media has changed everybody's lives, and if they don't think it has, I don't think they're paying attention. When it comes to health and social media, it's crazy in terms of what the insight is. Number one, more people go and watch willingly bad information that's inaccurate on YouTube and places like that than visit FDA websites, NIH, or pharma kind of combined. So just in terms of where the eyeballs are, it's kind of Jersey Shore. I'm just speaking frankly in terms of, I've learned these things from colleagues at Cisco that study the internet, and they say, Rob, not only is the majority of information video, but it applies to every vertical, including healthcare. Some groups like Mayo Clinic have turned it into a business, right? And University of Maryland Medical Center last year put their whole library up. So The fascination really is that social media, if it could be made compliant, what could that look like? And what we did then, before we went any further, is we studied the use of video in medicine. And I had the pleasure of talking about other people's research at an FDA hearing on the 27th of September. And the story is pretty simple, that as a value add to the labor being expended on the patient, whether it's inpatient, outpatient, any patient, video as an additive effect is really a turbocharger in terms of validated understanding of all parties, and most importantly, proven in places like Cleveland Clinic numbers of times, resulting in less utilization of health resources, greater health outcomes, and lower dependence upon the healthcare system. So the personal interest in social media and how it's really turned the tables on who pushes what, the fascination that people want to have video, and I think personally, as a surrogate for what they can't get. So in terms of the video that they'd like to see, look at the popular video doctors out there. It's Dr. Oz. It's Dr. Sanjay Gupta. This is what's about to happen, where people that make it simple connect it to the information so people know what's going on, regardless of what language. And the 24/7 connected nature of mobile just makes it all better, because health is 24/7. You could really look at a group like this, this meeting here is talking about ill care, because most of the focus is on where the money's going. And to the points in your slides, it's on not coaching the gaps, but just getting paid where we get paid until we don't get paid that way anymore. So.
Great. You know, I think that leads. that leads.
That was for Jersey Shore. Right?
Yeah. I'm a Jersey Shore fan out there. I think that leads well into you know, Rachel, I was going to ask you to maybe describe for us a little bit about what your efforts are in terms of promoting IT adoption, you know, broadly across New York, and how much of your efforts are focused on consumer-facing type, you know, opportunities today, and where you see that going over the next several years.
Sure. So just briefly in terms of what's going on here in New York State, in 2005 the legislature had a vision, and that vision had to do with sort of the total disconnect between where health reform was going or needed to go and the actual capabilities of our healthcare system to respond effectively to that, and in particular the significant lack of capital funding or capital capacity in our healthcare system. So they created $1 billion of capital funding, which was then matched with additional federal funds through a waiver that we have with the federal government, and basically created this large pool of capital financing dollars, a portion of which was set aside to help to foster health IT adoption and health information exchange activities across New York as one component of an overall approach to really modernizing our healthcare system. There are other aspects of that program that I'm not going to talk about tonight, but the theory was that if we could actually get some of these modernization efforts in place and connect some of the dots better, particularly at the community level, then we would be better positioned to advance state health reform goals. Again, this is before all this federal health reform stuff materialized. But really, it's all pretty much consistent in terms of where all this is going. So we really focused on several levels. One is governance and policy. If we're actually going to exchange information across disparate parties, we need common policies and standards to help govern how that's done. And from our perspective, the community really needs to own a significant part of the responsibility for helping to make that happen, because while technology should be very broadly enabling, healthcare delivery is mainly local in terms of what happens on a day-to-day basis, notwithstanding the excellent point about the need to have longitudinal capabilities as well. We focused on developing health information exchange capabilities at the community level, and by the time we get through the middle of next year, we will have something like a statewide health information network in New York as a result of those efforts. But interestingly, I'd say about 2/3 of the funding that we have put out through these grants has actually just gone to trying to get the basic tools out into particularly the physician practices so that they will be in a position to be able to contribute and consume data that will result from all of the health information exchange that we're envisioning supporting this new healthcare system. My office is called the Office of Health Information Technology Transformation. And so really what we're focusing on now is we've kind of done the IT piece. We've gotten things started at least. Now we're really zeroing in on the transformation part, and I think that's how it ties into this evening's topic. So, and Ray mentioned several of these factors in his presentation, but clearly from a public policy perspective, the overwhelming burden of chronic disease, how we're going to actually more effectively manage that and deal with the cost issues associated with that really moves right into the forefront. Care coordination is very much now the mantra that we're using to try to describe a system that we think will deliver care more effectively, but also that will be better for patients and more satisfactory to them. These programs really need to be inclusive not only of the microcosm of physicians and hospitals, but of community-based services, of public health, of non-healthcare systems and providers. So where I'm going with this is to sort of set the stage that if we really look at care coordination in the broadest possible context, things like mobilely enabled technology inevitably become a part of the mix because it's the only way we could possibly tackle these challenges in an effective and an efficient way. The problem we have is that, and again, Ray alluded to this a little bit, in addition to the complexity of our healthcare system, government programs and private health plans are incredibly slow at adopting innovation. And we could have a whole other panel discussion probably about why that is true. But it's not just government, believe me, it's both sides of the equation. They're very slow to adopt new ideas and to promote them. So I think there's two sort of factors that need to go down the road together here if mobile technologies are going to become a more prominent feature of these programs. One is to really keep our eye on the ball that ultimately, while we're going to talk a lot about financing models and ACOs and all that sort of thing, what we're really aiming for is a healthcare system which is more focused on patient-centered healthcare and population-based healthcare. And that's really what has to drive sort of a different paradigm in terms of thinking about what we're after. And ultimately, standards combined with payment policy is really what's going to change behavior. I'd like to think it could be more idealistic than that, but I really think that the reality of past experience and what we're seeing now in IT suggests that that is true. And so we need to get to a point where we not only have the standards and the payment policy, but effective mechanisms to really drive broad adoption. To use your example of the paperless hospital that exists in an environment where nobody else is paperless, that's not how this is going to work. So we really need to have systems out there that are really driving much broader and much more rapid adoption of these tools and technologies. I think it all adds up to creating an environment in which mobile technologies to support healthcare improvement should be poised to have an incredibly significant impact. But innovation, payment policy, and standards, connecting those dots is not something we do very well. So hopefully we'll get some more ideas tonight about how that can work better.
Right. And it's interesting, you know, as you talk about some of the challenges you just described for getting these innovations, you know, introduced to the system. You know, I was going to ask Theo to comment on, you know, some of the work he's done in clinical decision support applications that are meant to provide sort of guidance and evidence-based, you know, sort of protocols to optimal care methodologies. And really, as a physician himself, and talk more broadly about the challenges in getting these applications, you know, sort of to be bought in by the physician, because that's obviously ultimately where the rubber hits the road.
Change in medicine is very hard, as you know. My favorite story is an operation that was done in 1896 at the London Hospital. It was one of the first neurosurgical operations ever done in Britain to be called a neurosurgical operation. And the surgeon, very, very well known, a fellow named Victor Horsley, real pioneer, got dressed up, wore gown, glove, mask, you know, the whole Monty. It was a sterile technique. And 2 weeks later, the British Medical Journal complimented him on the operation and said this was a 2-hour operation that was a tour de force. But had he been a better surgeon, he would not have needed sterile technique. And that was because there was some question of whether the time that was required and getting dressed up in the mufti was really worthwhile. That attitude that a good physician is somebody who doesn't need a lot of instruments, doesn't need a lot of implementation, doesn't need a lot of instrumentation, doesn't need a lot of stuff. That's something that's really, really deep. So there's a wonderful story about a leprechaun who goes into a bar, and he's got a hat, and on top of the hat is a large, jolly, oily, and very ugly toad. And the barkeep looks at this and says, "Where in the world did you get that?" And the toad says, "They're all over Ireland, if you know where to look." And the problem is a little bit, where do you look and how do you identify it? So what I'd like to do is to take a point of view, and it's a perspective. It's not necessarily one that I agree with entirely. But let me start to talk about a little bit of the problem of trying to move physicians into the new age. And to kind of put things in perspective, I'm about as bad as you can get when you get into somebody who's mired in medicine, because I'm a physician, my wife's a physician, my mother was a physician, my daughter's a physician, I've got another daughter who's going to medical school, I've got a brother-in-law who's a dean, and it goes on and on and on and on and on and on. So I see it sort of from the inside. A couple of things. Change is very hard for physicians because of the way physicians are trained. There is traditionally a triad, a trifecta, if you will, of what physicians are supposed to do. Number one, they're supposed to take care of patients individually. So if you go to a physician, you do not want the physician to be talking about a population. You want the physician focused on you. Number two, you want good technical care. So you always have this question of the surgeon who's got a great bedside manner, as opposed to the surgeon who knows how to operate. Push comes to shove, you want the gal or the guy who knows how to operate. Third thing is, what is your responsibility? Is your responsibility to practice good population medicine? Do I turn to you and do I say, gee, I'm so sorry, in terms of the rationing that we have in medicine, we really can't treat your problem, it's not worth treating? Or do I say, I'm going to stave off the angel of death with a spear, and that's my job, and leave away completely the issue of end-of-life care from a humanistic perspective. I'm speaking purely economically. So I had the privilege of training in the US, and I had the privilege of training in Britain. And in Britain, on Wednesday afternoon between 1 and 3, I saw 60 neurosurgical patients. No exaggeration. Somebody had a brain tumor, and they were told, I'm sorry, Mr. Smith, there's really nothing we can do for you. I want you to go back to your general practitioner, and we'll arrange radiation therapy. That takes 4 minutes. First time I did an aneurysm in Great Britain, I spent an hour with the patient talking about the procedure and getting informed consent. My consultant came to me and said, there, that's not the way we do it. Went to the next patient that he was going to operate on and said, Mrs. Smith, you have an aneurysm, shall we mend it tomorrow? That was the discussion. They all work within the system, but the sociological infrastructure is really quite different. Again, forgive me for being personal, but to try to express this in terms of the sort of the portfolio that I have, which is to talk about problems with adoption, I'm just going to do this. I first got interested in decision support and artificial intelligence systems when I started operating an arteriovenous malformations, which are deep malformations inside of the brain. And I have a child, a 14-year-old girl, who lost her speech because of a hemorrhage. And the conventional wisdom was you don't operate on these things because you only make them worse. So I looked in the literature, and I didn't think that's what the literature really said. I did operate on her. Very fortunately for her and for me, she did very well, and she in fact regained her speech a day after the operation. And so the question was, how do you make a decision? What is the basis on which you classify these things? You make the decision whom to operate on, whom not. What can you do? The Japanese were injecting vitamin E and giving boron and trying to radiate. Americans were operating. English were doing nothing. French had very good interventional radiology and were doing things which were endovascular, which we weren't doing at that point. How do you actually decide? So we used a very primitive, I mean, it's so primitive, it's embarrassing, a very primitive artificial intelligence system to try to come up with algorithms. And as people looked at the algorithms, they said one of 3 things. You can't use an algorithm for this. I can do this better than the algorithm. You don't have enough cases to really give us significant data. And probably all three statements were correct. But this was a beginning and really launched, at least in neurosurgery, the decision-making on how to go about doing this. What we see in physicians today is young physicians know technology and medical students know technology. But if you're going to think in terms of the system that's going to use the kind of information infrastructure, Rachel, that you're talking about, you need to teach medical students and select medical students from the beginning who have an interest in this kind of technology. The second thing is you've got to train them to use it. So a perfect example of failure is the VISTA system that many of you may know in the VA. The VISTA system is an artificial intelligence system, but in order not to lose anything, every time you try to look information up, you have to see everything that happened before. There's no memory. So the amount of time that's involved gets in the way of process. The next thing is you have to differentiate between data and data collection and information. Information is what you work on. Data is what you spout out. In the evolution of the physician, you move from simple data to actually information. So for all of you who are medically sophisticated, whether you're medically trained or not, we can probably have a conversation in which we exchange a huge amount of information in just a few sentences. Whereas if we're talking about something that neither of us have expertise in, we're kind of clambering around trying to figure out what's relevant and what's not. And so a perfect example is dementia. You look at Alzheimer's disease. When I was taught Alzheimer's disease, it was precocious dementia. People, generally male, over the age of 4, under the age of 50, will begin having dementia. Today, the term is used much more broadly. It's very clear that it's used incorrectly. We do not have the information. So the question is, if somebody has dementia, how do you know that they have Alzheimer, which means that today they're really not treatable? Or how do you know that they have normal pressure hydrocephalus, which is a condition which probably is treatable? A small number of patients have normal pressure hydrocephalus. Ultimately, the only way in which you can see whether or not they're probably going to get benefit from an operation is to do a series of spinal taps. The information you get from imaging and from history is simply not useful. Some patients are also going to have a metabolic disease. Some patients are going to also have a problem with one of the vitamins B. Another group of people has had a series of strokes, and you can't get them better by controlling the blood pressure, but you have to control the blood pressure. How do you figure that out within the system that you have that's here? Some of it is art and some of it is not. So there seem to be 5 issues that are really problematic for people in medicine who are being asked to adopt. Let's call it healthcare reform writ large, in the sense that you were talking about. Okay, the first is, there's healthcare as a system, and there's healthcare for the individual. Most physicians go into medicine either because they're interested in science and they want to apply it, or because they're interested in people. Very few of them are actually interested in systems. And the expectation is, fix the system, give better care to the individual. I would submit that that has yet to be proven. It makes sense, but it's not proven, and we don't know how to do it. The second is that prevention is better than cure. So we know that that's true in obstetrics. We know that, and this has been perfectly well worked out, if you can stop a pregnant woman from using drugs, drinking, and smoking, if you can find who needs vitamin B12 so you can prevent spina bifida and other things, a dollar expended on prenatal care is worth at least $3 in postnatal care. Not to mention the problem with children who are born with issues. That's clear. It's yet to be determined whether you can prevent diabetes. It's yet to be determined whether you can prevent congestive heart failure. So the physicians are told on the one hand, accept evidence-based care, and on the other hand, they say, where's the evidence? It's really not there yet. The next is the idea that monitoring will lead to improvement. And Nick, this is to your point about the monitor and the sudden cardiac death. What happens when you look at that when you look at that proposition. You know that the FDA just approved a fairly expensive defibrillator cardiac rhythm monitoring device. I think it was last week. And I think it's $10,000 more than what's currently being sold for. And if I'm not mistaken, it's $35,000 with it, over $25,000. And it's clearly going to save lives, and it's clearly going to make class 2 and maybe even some class 1 heart failure better. Do you want to do that? Does it matter from a sociological standpoint? There's a drug that will increase survival from certain types of brain tumors by between 6 weeks and 3 months. It's called Gliadel. It's used almost routinely in the United States. Norway will not allow it to be used in Norway. They'd rather send their patients to the United States for treatment, pay for it, than approve it in Norway. Because they say from a systems perspective, it makes no sense. It doesn't matter. And the question is monitoring going to give us outcomes that matter, and how do we define what matter? The next is that in the past, we're dealing with information for the individual patient. Now we're dealing with information for a system. And the idea is more information is going to give you what's sometimes called the S cubed. It'll give you savings, it will give you studies, and it will give you solutions. Again, not clear that that's always the case. How much information, where does it go? The next is that care for the individual care for the individual will emanate from care for the population. Traditionally, when you look at systems that have been looking at population-based changes, when they've worked in infectious diseases and when they've worked in sanitation, huge difference. When you're talking about episodic care, very, very little difference. Unlikely you can do anything about hip degeneration by treating a population. Other things, yes. Diabetes, maybe. Heart care, maybe. The next thing is that if you look at what many of the systems purport to do, they purport to do something that you can do in the airline industry. If you take a look at some of the Airbuses or the McDonnell Douglas airplanes with a glass cockpit, what they do is say the checkout is done by the pilot, and then the plane basically flies itself from the point at which you are 50 to 100 feet off the ground, and it can even land itself. So it's a reduction of skill to technology. Physicians have always resisted that because, you know, how would you feel if in your profession somebody said you could be replaced by fill in whatever you want? I remember in New York when the first place that came up was with the shuttle between Grand Central and Penn Station, when the idea was you couldn't do that robotically, you always had to have a driver. And we're talking about exactly the same phenomenon in medicine. There's a fear that medicine is no longer about getting yourself to be as good as possible, it's getting yourself reduced to as low a level as possible. And is that really what you want for the system? Do you really want a robot when you have an artist? So these are just some of the things that turn out to be a very, very real issue. I'm not talking about workflow, I'm not talking about anything else. And I'm really talking about the fear of what it means to adopt a system-based medicine in which technology plays such a large part. I don't necessarily agree, by the way, with what I'm saying, but I did want to lay it out.
No, I was going to say, after all that, he's investing in a lot of interesting companies.
Oh, absolutely.
That are promoting, exactly what he's describing, the challenges that that will face those businesses. I think that was a great lead-in to Gopal, and Gopal, I'd love to have you as an entrepreneur, obviously a physician with a fairly diverse background. Talk a little bit about your business that you started and your company and some of the challenges you've seen, and to the extent your exposure to other healthcare models in other geographies and emerging markets has some relevance or some comparison points. That might be another interesting framework to give us.
I think that's what we're employed and inspired to do, is to look at the problem and throw it around and look at a perspective that says it's not working because it's not working. The obvious is really what we look at on a daily basis, and I think a lot of interesting opinion is being brought out, anecdotes of experience. Myself, also a neurosurgeon, has worked in many interesting environments, and quite frankly, healthcare is not foreign to technology. We've used it, it's advanced it, it's where we're getting all our data from imaging to diagnostics. Physicians have been using technology, and mobile is not new to healthcare. We've been using PDAs for a long time. Physicians are not averse to taking on any kind of innovation. We're doing image guidance, we've brought GPS to the operating rooms, image fusion, a lot of us write code. We're not foreigners to things that you may say scare us. And so yet we still have the issue of physicians not adopting technology. What they're not adopting is an inertia to workflow. And so I put it to you is that the opportunity as we look at this and the spaghetti trees and the conversations that we have is that information technology just slowed us down. We're looking at systems that were built that I would call legacy. And I challenge that, having actually been party to this and guilty of creating some information systems in operating rooms, is we built them to code so we could build. And that really was what we were doing. We would come into our M&M meetings and our business management unit meetings and discuss how we get up the code. And so we made more efficient ways to earn money, be revenue generating, and as surgeons subsidize the rest of the institution. That really was the initiative of collecting data. Unfortunately, and if I could give the comparison in the financial industry, what occurred with Bloomberg was we put current technology into the hands of financiers and the ability to use information in a constructive way or destructive, depending on the opinion that you have here right now. But we were able to use data efficiently in a very modernistic fashion. Right now, healthcare IT is struggling because IT-enabled services based off these legacy systems that we call modern is really a collision of care. We're colliding with a workflow that's become so inefficient, so burdensome. It's very difficult for physicians to adopt. Turn it around and say, okay, let's give up on the doctor, let's go to the consumer. Another interesting conundrum, they don't pay for it. So how does an entrepreneur face that? And very quickly, Dauphin, what we're doing is really looking at the problem of the phone call to the physician. The number of times you play phone tag with a doctor, and we're focused on pediatrics, so look at the parent scenario, phone tag with a doctor, a 6-minute call, maybe 3 to 5 data points, and the doctor gets frustrated, parent gets frustrated, parent doesn't want to upset the physician is doing this pro bono, call basically ends with, go into the ER, my resident will see you, and they'll report back to me. So we've just added cost and burden to the system, and every kind of infrastructure that we deal to shield a doctor doing triage by inserting those practitioners, by inserting other systems, we're only adding cost. So I look at it and say, the problem is that the situation is so broken, and it's so obvious to us that we have to deconstruct it and reinvent it. So when I look at mobility, when we talk about M-Health, when we talk about healthcare IT-enabled services, consumer health, all of these new terms are coming up. What we're finding and struggling to solve is really just workflow. The greatest opportunity for technology right now is to take one of these things and say, I can move data on this so rapidly, and you can click and swipe and send to anybody. It's easy to get a photo, it's easy to find people, it's easy to connect them, it's easy to create secure portals. All of that's done. We just haven't used it in an appropriate way. And so, as an entrepreneur, I'm looking at it and saying there's huge opportunity where, unfortunately, in a situation where we haven't digitized a lot of the annotations that occur by a physician in a consultative fashion. We have digitized information. We have imaging, we have lab data, we have monitoring systems. So a lot of this is, housed in electrons whizzing around us. What we haven't done is digitize the ability of a physician to get information into the system, because what we're really after is the expert opinion. When you opine on the data, what is the issue that we're trying to deal with the patient? The rest of the data is meaningless. So getting to evidence-based protocols, evidence-based medicine, what's really interesting is we have no evidence. Even if you splice all the pharmaceutical trials and you look at how we've characterized segmented information, it's still an empirical decision when you have a patient in front of you. You can only extrapolate from data to get to a clinical decision. So that, that opinion is really the value. That currently exists in voice. because it goes to a recording machine, and God forbid a physician actually spends some time on a computer terminal, will make a note that's really meaningless. It's not good enough. And so what we need to do is figure out a much cleaner, simpler way to collect that data and have actionable information. We've got data all around us, but we haven't figured out through our protocols and our algorithms what we can act on. To go back to a lot of the surgical systems that we develop, and I think it's one of the most advanced parts of medicine, is we have actionable data. We can see targets, we can hone in on them, we can actually take targets out. We can use energy, we can use scalpels, we can use a variety of tools. If we apply the same principles to workflow just in simple primary care, we'll be able to make it more efficient, we'll address the issue of cost, we'll address two more important issues, which no one talks about, which is really kind of glossed over in policy, and that's productivity and access. And let's face it, there are not going to be enough doctors to treat all of the issues as they start to show themselves. Access is going to be a huge issue. As we look at pediatrics, 2/3 of our physicians are female. They're going to have families, they're going to have part-time. The FTE keeps dropping, and the FTE is falling off a cliff. Telehealth is not going to solve this. We're going to have software solutions that fit into the capability and ability of a physician to make a decision. We've feared for many years that the physician will become automated. And it's not just, as you all know, it's not just the physician that's resisting that. We are all dinosaurs. The comet hit many years ago, but we've survived it so many times. And yet again, we're here, the collision of information technology with healthcare. This is the third decade I'm seeing it, so we still haven't died yet. But if you look at it from the perspective of, what is that future? How do we automate it? What do we automate? We can automate it. There's a significant resistance from regulatory. We are fearful that if we do automate it, if we do start suggesting to physicians, where's the liability going to be housed? And companies fear that much more than physicians fear that. So, those are the interesting concepts that we look at. I think, Ray, you bring up a lot of interesting points of, where the future is. At the end of the day, as we create businesses, show me the money is the crystal ball we're all staring at. And freemiums are really kind of rife right now in social networks and technology. We're hoping that motivation and value created for a consumer is the new way to pay for healthcare. You won't pay for all of it, but you'll pay for value if you can avoid waiting in a waiting room, or avoid the phone tag, or avoid the wait and anticipation of an opinion about a result. And so those are the things that I think entrepreneurs are focused on right now. And there's a real hotbed of activity as we start to understand human behavior in a whole different way. If we can get healthcare out of the enterprise, we'll have taken the first step to actually solving this problem.
That's great. I'm going to ask one question to the panel, and then we'll open it up for your questions. But as I listen to everybody's comments, I heard a couple of themes. I think one which I alluded to, one which I really hadn't touched on. One was about the challenge of getting adoption. So we can define a lot of interesting technologies, interesting capabilities, whether it's decision support, mHealth, whatever it might be. But ultimately, how do we overcome the inertia of a healthcare system that historically has been slow to adopt this? And I thought it was interesting, we heard that, echoed across, I think, almost everybody's comments, or at least 4 of the 5 comments. And then secondly, and somewhat related, is to the extent we promote adoption from a workflow standpoint, which is a key point several people made, how do we figure out the right revenue model? So from a practical standpoint, a sustainable business proposition that somehow marries the value delivered to the revenue of the company that's going to help deliver that value. And Rachel, I thought I'd kick off with you, because one of the questions a lot of people always ask when they think about health information exchanges is there's a great impetus, and there's many of these state-based or municipality-based HIEs sprouting up across the country with great initial funding and initial goals and targets. But ultimately, I think there's an expectation of self-sustainability of these HIEs. And I'd love to get your thoughts on how that influences your activities and sort of what you envision for the future, because at some point I assume you're not going to want to keep providing the grant money to continue the technology, the investment that you've started.
That's right. As far as I know, the grant money is done, although we weren't expecting our last round of funding to be available either, so you never know. In New York, we seem to find very interesting ways of solving our budget problems by spending more money, but anyway. And I guess actually the federal government does that too. At least in our experience, and again, going back to a little bit of our philosophy, the community needs to own the value proposition for health information exchange. Driving adoption and use is primarily, from our perspective, a community-driven activity. And all of our grant programs have required a minimum of 50% matching funds to come from the community, which could be actual cash dollars, in which part of it is, but some of it is in-kind contributions. But in any case, about half of our funding really has come from that local match. So I think that that's a pretty good start in terms of looking at a community-based sustainability model as far as we've gotten. Now what we're struggling with is we aren't really sure that we've created the most efficient and effective means of transporting health information more broadly between those communities, so that a physician in New York City could readily access information from the Rochester Rio or what have you. And these scenarios are pretty real in terms of looking at quite a variety of referral patterns and so forth that actually exist in the real world today. So we're exploring whether we should in fact centrally offer some of these core, what we call core services, which everybody has to have in order to implement information exchange. And that has now raised again the question of what sort of a business model or sustainability model is associated with that, and really who would the customer be. And I think a real concern that on the one hand, we think that in fact it should be the provider that ultimately values these services because they make a difference in terms of their ability to deliver care or to do that more cost effectively. But that is a very unknown proposition at this point. And frankly, even if it were to happen, making that administratively simple, I think is an enormous challenge. So that's one side of the equation. The other is that, at least from our perspective, we think this is a public policy problem, not just a market problem, and that markets can solve certain things well, but not necessarily if what you really think you're doing is creating, which we do, a public utility which every New Yorker should have access to or should benefit from. And the market isn't necessarily going to do a good job with that without introducing some public policy solutions that will really deal with some of these funding issues in the long run. We have several communities where local health plans have actually invested significantly in these RIOs, and that's a key part of their sustainability model today and will be in the future, because the health plans see the benefit that they're going to get once a full-blown health information exchange capability exists. Unfortunately, we don't have Medicare in the game, and we don't have the national health plans in the game. So while that might work in some communities in upstate New York, where mainly these local health plans are the predominant payers, it doesn't work in New York City, and it doesn't work in several other communities where either national plans or Medicare is a very significant part of the mix. So I think that leads us, again, directly into the health reform discussion in a way, because what we're seeing is that if we don't have two levels of collaboration, one is multi-payer collaboration around a common approach to these issues, and provider-payer collaboration, getting away from the more antagonistic relationship, which typically exists in most places. That's really the kind of structure that we need in order to come up with some solutions that will have a chance of working on a more enduring basis, but it really will require everybody to get on the same page, and that's just as hard as getting physicians to change how they think and do things.
Yeah, well, depending on what just, sort of getting a revenue model for, advanced technology you want to go with.
And the adoption?
Yes, and the
Right,
adoption.
right.
Sure, either side, sure.
A number of panels have already talked about it, maybe the third decade of topics like this. But there's been one difference, and Rachel, you just referred to it, and that is the healthcare reform inducements and penalty phase that's going to kick in, right? And strategy is great, but when suddenly there's either a disincentive or a new payment stream, then Ray, really what you set us up describing of a system that pays on interventions, not on prevention and wellness, the beginning phase is about to start. And in October, November of next year, the preventable readmissions at the hospital is either going to shut departments down or make them prosper, and that Michael Porter excellence drives the market that the healthcare reform is based on. So by following the pay-for-performance little surrogates, the little sentinels that are coming, and then tracking against, I think, one important thing, and I think I'm really here as the voice for the patient and understanding, I think. The patient, the expert patient, is the single biggest factor in this whole equation. The doctor that knows everything, the nurse that knows everything, that makes expert diagnosis with a healthcare system that doesn't get in the way, that facilitates their excellent delivery of care, still gets to the doorstep of the patient and the caregiver, and they go, what did you say? What is it I have to do again? What are my choices? And how to do that in a consistent and compliant way so the expert patient completes the equation. What I'm really saying is, as we watch these bets on the best tool that lowers hospital readmission rates, look to see where the popularity is at the patient level. And my thesis is the most popular applications, technology systems, will be the ones that patients feel give them more time, more personal time with either their doctor or a healthcare professional, and in a way that's conversational and easy. It's not about data, it's about understanding. So watching the incentives, I don't think there's anything else but incentives. That's the reason the audience is here, to find out where the new incentives are going to be. And we'd be wise just to watch. And it's less than 12 months away in terms of the below average hospitals getting dinged by penalties that could shut down whole hospitals here in this city.
Yeah, I mean, it's got multiple dimensions. So there's base reimbursement changes that start taking place.
Which steer us towards pay for performance.
Which pay for performance. On a pure technology standpoint, they took a carrot and a stick approach where you're going to get incentives for the next 5 years to invest in IT as a hospital operator. But in 2016, you're actually going to get negative hits to Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement if you don't have certain levels of sort of proficiency. Yeah, let me jump in, Chair.
I don't know if this is a question, a criticism, or I misheard you. So,
maybe
you mentioned the expert patient, and I'm thinking of myself as a patient, and I'd like to be involved, I'd like to understand the choices, but I don't want to be an expert. I'm not an expert,
right.
And I don't want to have to become an amateur doctor in order to cope with the system.
Right.
You know, I want you to talk to me for a few minutes about what you know, so I'm comfortable with the choices, and we go ahead without being an expert.
Well,
I don't know what you meant by expert patient or not.
I think it falls within that broad definition, but not within the part you don't like.
And I don't know if I'm typical or not.
Expert patient was actually a term given to us a few months ago through conversations we were having with the Department of Health in the UK, not NHS, but the government body. And what they've been trying to do at their primary care trusts level is leverage the patients that know how to manage their disease, the credibility, the YouTube authenticity of that type of, call it content, to teach that 2/3 of medicine that's about adjusting, that's about complying, that's about learning the healthy behaviors so the medicine and the doctors, it'll all come together. So the source credibility that explains some of the YouTube. I mean, think about it. You come home and let's say one of our children just got diagnosed with ADHD. Do I read the pamphlet from pharma company that the doctor gave me? You go right to YouTube, you try to find a mom like you that's dealing with this, and you make your own decision. Call that expert patient, call a patient advisor. The issue is making it compliant. And if it's compliant, doctors love it as long as it's not questioning their decision. A major hospital in New York, here's an example. How do you live on less than 1 gram of salt per day if you're a congestive heart failure patient? I challenge everybody here in this room to do it. There's patients at this hospital that give master classes and teach people. That's a broken way to do it. There's a much better way to do it.
You know, and then they can't.
You know, I think what we're getting to is the complexity of this entire thing. It's not straightforward. Rachel, if I can just comment on something, you used the term a regulated utility for healthcare. And you know, everybody who's taken a course in economics knows that a regulated utility is a situation in which you price things based on the marginal cost once you get to scale. And the question is there such a thing as getting healthcare to scale? And can you do the cost accounting to be able to get yourself to the marginal cost? And the reason that I bring this up is, one, will you get physicians to work for you? Number two, will you get patients to be satisfied with the utility? And three, will you have either formally a dual-tier system, as you always had in the UK, or will you have a shadow economy in which physicians will take under-the-table money, the way it's being done in many parts of the world, in order to provide access and convenience, and I would even say quality, certainly in the sense of comfort. So while we're talking about this kind of healthcare, which is some combination of episodic healthcare and care for chronic diseases, and I think it's probably important to separate those two. When you talk about doing that for the population as a whole, critical need, especially for the patients who are not necessarily documented, who in many ways are the most vulnerable. Do you also need to take into account the interests of the patients who are perfectly willing to get involved in concierge medical systems, specifically because they want that convenience?
So I would suggest that everybody in this room is or will become their own primary care provider to some level today. How many of you have children, spouse, or more likely elderly parents that you help manage their care? Hands up, you know. And whilst I respect what you say, that you don't want to be that expert and have to deal with the detail, I think the biggest push in the industry will come from the consumers who demand the information and the sharing of that information to effectively manage that care and to be able to coordinate it and then access those resources to help guide that process effectively. And for me, that's the biggest driver in this industry. And if you, one other point to make, if you go back enough time, and it's not that far back, number one, medical textbooks used to be off limits to the general public. Think about that. And not that long ago, the medical record used to be off limits to the patient. Now it's considered the property of the patient, although physicians sometimes disagree and it's their communication between physicians. But for the most part, it's my record, and for 30 years I've carried around my medical record in this form. I've digitized it now, and I've lived in 7 or 8 different countries, and I carried it around with me, and now it's moving into the mobile world so that I can always pull it out and share it.
Okay, let me open it up for questions. I see a hand in the back there.
This question for Dr. Chopra.
If you can stand up, I'm sorry.
Question for Dr. Chopra. Given that majority of physicians, empirical information that I have, say that they will not be ready to meet meaningful use standards for in January of 2011, and they're not going to be able to implement their EMRs in January of 2011. Do you believe that there's going to be an extension? and then another extension for physicians to be able to meet needs, and that's going to result in bad behaviors from physicians to believe that they'll actually collect the meaningful use dollars on a reliable basis from the government, especially because only 10% of physicians are ready for implementation in January, when meaningful use rates of requirements go live. What is the Pavlovian reaction of physicians when they aren't ready?
So I can just, I'll simplify. I think that what we're trying to get at here is the EMRs have to be implemented in some way. Meaningful use is a criteria that we are now getting incentive payments for to implement the practices. Many EMRs still don't qualify for a lot of the meaningful use criteria, and there are companies playing catch up, but some more of the sophisticated solutions already are. There's clearly no standardization. That could change rapidly. So there's a lot of uncertainty in both definition and compliance and standards. Physicians are very confused. You go to any practice and you ask them, what's meaningful use? What's error? How much are you going to get back from the government if you institute the solution? All they know is they're going to spank me if I don't get this done. And it's costly, and I don't really want to do it. And I think in a very confused environment like that with no clarity, we need some guidance. We need people that can come in and explain to physicians, but there's a lot of fear. I don't think it's enough time. There's absolutely no way it's going to get done. And I don't think, we've seen how many decades of care things haven't changed quick enough. Despite the theories of fast adoption and infrastructure, we have the infrastructure. We're just not implementing this. And there are many confused incentives and behavioral issues that occur in this. So I think, just the short answer is there's absolutely not enough time. Extension is going to happen, but we're not even clear on the standard. That's going to change. When that changes, what happens? And so, again, you put in a legacy system like this, you're going to have problems. Hence the smile of an entrepreneur. It's like, let's bring this on and let's solve this differently. But I think, digitizing medical records, which is digitizing the physician opinion, is really the crux of the issue. Everything else is digitized. And what we need to do is network it, and you need to own it. And the physician is now taking on this burden in their practices. It's costly, not from a perspective of just paying for it, but the productivity hit on these practices is crushing. They're all going to consolidate. So we're seeing a market shift that's just going to rapidly change healthcare. I don't know that it's for the better. So, I think welcome everybody else's opinion. If I were a practicing physician, I'd run away. I think this is just not going to happen.
With that said, I think that the voice interface is critical.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the gate.
The pitch for nuance
You got a marketing budget? Or
But I think, Terry, you're reinforcing the point is the most critical information that's being exchanged, the physician discussion with another physician, and the physician annotation summary at the end of opining upon all of the data in front of them. If you do not digitize that, you have not got useful, actionable information.
Go ahead,
I'd like to add a little bit to that. So I would say, and fundamentally I agree that consultation and the capturing of that information, if I was to put out a vision of where I think this has to go, and I think we're still a ways away from a technology standpoint, the interaction between both physician and physician, that clinical decision-making process, as well as the clinician-patient, would be essentially recorded and converted into clinically actionable information by technology for review concurrently with the patient on a system that would essentially take that data and present it in a form that structured it, gave you actionable information that you could then do things with. We're a ways away from that because it's two conversations, and to take two conversations and to extract information, just the text, is very, very hard to do. People are very good at what's termed the cocktail effect. You can listen to a conversation that's going on behind you whilst having a conversation with somebody. Computers are not, as of today. The process of extracting information and creating clinically actionable data is absolutely a ways down. I think we're very close to being able to deliver that. But the extract of two voices is today challenging, but I think that's where we want to get to.
Ray, can I just add one other thing?
Sure.
So I know a lot of attention and confusion has gone into the meaningful use discussion, but I think it's really important to put it into context. One of my colleagues, John Glasser, who now works with Siemens, had a slide at a presentation yesterday that sort of tallied up all of the things that hospitals need to be prepared for to do just over the next 2 years. And meaningful use is the least of it. You've got the threat of significant Medicare payment reductions in play, particularly on the physician side. You've got all of those health reform things that we've already listed out for you. You've got the preventable readmission payment policy. You've got all of these different things, and then there's ICD-10, the 5010 claims transaction, on and on and on. And I will bet you $1 that Congress will come in next year, forget about whether they repeal health reform or not repeal health reform. That's not the point. They're going to add more new things into the mix because that's what Congress does. So if I'm looking at this from a provider perspective, I think the difficulty in saying I'm just going to ignore it is that you might think you can ignore meaningful use, but I don't think you can ignore all of the other things that are coming down the road unless you think you could actually have a sustainable practice as 100% private pay. And I don't think most practices are in position to do that. So I think that in some ways it's sad because meaningful use has become a little bit of a distraction from the bigger picture. And I hope that through a combination of forces, we can both better educate and make this work in a more coherent way. But I have to say that the long history of the Medicare program in particular would suggest that what we have to look forward to will be adding more things onto the plate that people need to figure out how to do, rather than trying to make it more streamlined and easier to implement.
Should we take one more question or should we wrap?
No, I was going to say I have a question.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead.
I feel like in the healthcare system, there are a lot of constituents. So there's the patient, the doctors, the insurance companies, the hospitals, the health technology providers. If you were to sit down each constituent, because I feel like in some ways they have overlapping interests and in some ways they have conflicting interests. If you were to sit down each constituent and say, here's the one area where you need to give a little bit. It may not be in your personal best interest, pharmaceutical companies or health IT companies or doctors, but you need to give a little bit here to help move the whole system forward. What would you say to each group? So for example, we have a patient here or somebody who says, I don't want to be the family physician in training, but you're saying tough luck, deal with it. You're going to have to take control of your family's health care. You're going to have to be knowledgeable. You're going to have to search online, find good information. So can you talk about each of those groups and where you think each needs to give?
Well, I guess I would tee up the juxtaposition of my comments about population health and Tio's comments about the overwhelming emphasis of both the overall medical care system and of individual physicians being based on the individual unit of care or the interaction with an individual patient. And I'd like to think that there's a way to make those things more compatible with each other, because I agree that right now the incentives are not structured that way at all, whether they're cultural issues, payment issues, systemic issues. So I think that it's a little bit of a 30,000-foot comment, but I think we have to reconcile the model, the mental model and the actual physical model of care delivery to make individual care better through information, but also to bring population-based care more into the forefront, because the kinds of challenges that we're facing really will require a much more robust look at information across different settings and across individuals, creating those more longitudinal, more public health oriented kinds of capabilities And that shouldn't be a totally separate discussion from improving the interaction of an individual with their physician around a particular issue that they have that day.
Go ahead.
I think it's a great question. I don't think that's the way we would probably ask it in a stakeholder meeting, but I understand the question. I think the easiest answer to that, and again, an advocate for what works, people that know what they're doing are better patients and the costs go down and so forth. The challenge really with kind of the stakeholder wheel in healthcare is everybody's doing their own single point solution. Right? If I'm Siemens, I'm selling an image bank that makes diagnosis better. If I'm a pharma company, I'm saying, well, if you take this medicine, I'll throw this thing in here for you. Each one of them is lobbying for too much. They're lobbying for a total engagement just on their terms with patient, caregiver, family member in the middle. The insurance company does it, the hospital I just got discharged from does it. That's the challenge. And appreciation and the give is really an appreciation that looking at things that work. If you look to where WebMD kind of filled the 1.0 web space, it represented a central place that people didn't have to have individual relationships with all these different companies and stakeholders. I can get my Weight Watchers stuff on there. So these central destinations is the give. That's going to freak people out. But that's exactly what people want. Health is one thing to an individual. To a hospital, it's my discharge. To a pharma company, it's my refill. It's one thing to the individual. So media that brings that clarity of the individual as the focus is really the give. Pharma companies are building all these very elegant and sometimes very good websites. Merck has a really great one called Merck Engage. And the problem with the concept is not that Merck Engage isn't fantastic. It is fantastic, from what I've seen of it. The problem is the average person doesn't even know who makes their medicine. So the realistic expectation of the best way to impact that patient might not be through a direct relationship of me, but to be part of a more cohesive engagement the way WebMD did 10 years ago.
So from a practitioner standpoint, I think the most important give is the willingness to be subjected to measurement of outcomes and of practice. And I'm separating those because outcomes is one thing and practice is another. If every time you leave the office you're well, because you're angry at me because I don't treat you well, ultimately that's not effective. So there has to be some way of doing that. But with that said, I would say one more thing, which is that we have a system of healthcare and healthcare education in this country that doesn't work. When you compare England, where the most a medical student is going to pay is £5,000 a year. Most students get loans and bursaries. And it's 5 years, so £25,000 max to go to medical school. And you compare that to the United States, where it's 8 years for an average in a non-state system of $50,000 now, and then in a state system it drops to maybe 3/4 of that, maybe a little bit less. There's got to be a give someplace in the system. You can't have a utility-style program where you ask people to do things, and yet a training program that costs money doesn't work. Then the other thing that you have to deal with is the rules for accountability from a legal perspective. If the legal requirement, if the standard of care is somebody comes in with a head injury, minor head injury, they play soccer, daughter plays soccer, she's maybe knocked out for a second. Does she have to have a CAT scan? And what if she later develops hematoma? Am I going to be held liable for not doing a CAT scan? Because if I am, I'm going to do the CAT scan, I'm sorry. How do we do that?
So, a great question. I'm just going to go straight out and answer against four groups. Patients, you can't treat everything. No treatment is sometimes the best treatment. Providers, you don't know everything. You need help. Payers, fix the incentive system, stop paying for us to do stuff. And the pharma system needs to change the incentive and the research and development process so that there is a more economical model to continue the development and reinvestment without raping and pillaging customers for the price of drugs ongoing.
It's interesting. I would just, put an exclamation point on that. I think all four of Nick's points come down to volume, the way I look at it. Everybody in the healthcare system, including consumers, we just want every possible element of care that we can get. And that's what we sort of feel entitled to. Obviously, that's how providers get paid historically. So getting into pay for performance and other quality-based, reimbursement mechanisms changes that whole, mentality and whole incentive structure. Same thing goes for pharmaceutical companies. Maybe you're not going to sell as many pills, but if you can prove the efficacy of your pills, we'll be willing to pay you for that, but we're not going to pay you for the sort of the non-validated, applications. And I think that's a whole, structural, challenge of our healthcare system that absolutely has to change, which, candidly, I would have hoped, just an editorial note, would have been part of the whole reform effort, which obviously was completely, ignored. Sure.
Second question, as an IP lawyer, if we shot all of the malpractice lawyers and turned them into organ donors, if we had less of this defensive medicine and more rational, hey, there are trade-offs, life's imperfect, things will happen even if we do it right, let's be sensible. Would that make a 5, 10, 50%? I mean, is that a huge, or it's clearly a big annoyance, but what's the estimate as the impact if you could somehow fix that? And, magically, I understand it may not be realistic.
I think it's still a big incentive issue. If malpractice is some of it, defensive medicine is a significant part of cost, but the incentive program in healthcare is perverse. We're just not practicing clean healthcare. I think you need to fix that first.
Here's the issue. There are three standards of care. There is the individual patient staving off the angel of death with a spear, which cost benefit, which cost efficiency. And you can add another layer, which is the layer of population. And when you look at standard of care does not necessarily reflect evidence-based medicine. And the evidence that falls into evidence-based medicine is not universal. So, on the one hand, the first day I started my internship, my chief resident said to me, there's an operation in every patient, and your job is to find it. We don't do that quite so readily. So, no, that's not it. But on the other hand, the truth of the matter is, as Nick said, you can't fix everything. And so here's the question. I have a 70-year-old woman who's got a compressive spine fracture, and she's osteoporotic, and I can make her better in 3 days by means of a vertebroplasty, which costs whatever it costs, or what I can do is wait 4 months, and she's probably going to feel a whole lot better. What's the standard of care?
Sure.
Just one, and I don't have the answer, but watch the UK system and the US system, where we're in the same boatload of hurt. Every issue is almost equally reproducible. One of the differences is the number of, I guess, living lawyers for this country versus that. Now, it still doesn't speak to the motivation. So, I mean, you have a perfect kind of controlled experiment to watch, and the incentives have already, the disincentives, the responsibility of hospitals for that 30-day after discharge. It's already started in the UK. So you got a preview of maybe things that may be bulletproof from a legal kind of thing here in a few months.
Remember, just one thing, remember on the malpractice. So you have a duty, you have proximate cause, you have injury. And so the question is, can you, in some sense, change what you mean by duty? That's really what we're talking about.
I'm sorry, back there.
This question is for Tio. Tio, if you could invent a medical school from scratch, anywhere you want in the country, what would it look like? What would you teach these medical students, both technically and socially or culturally?
Strangely enough, I was today at Mount Sinai in that discussion, last week at the Cleveland Clinic in that discussion. I chair the medical school in Belfast, Northern Ireland, where we have that discussion. We're going to have it again in 2 weeks. I don't know that I'm smart enough to give you that answer. A lot of people are talking about that. There's certain things that happen in the United States that probably should be changed. The first is that you probably don't need 4 years of college to go to medical school. The second is there really is such a thing as teaching population-based medicine as opposed to teaching individual-based medicine. The next thing is you probably want to have some kind of a National Health Service Corps. To me, it makes absolutely no sense that if somebody's going to be subsidized in whatever way, they don't have an obligation to serve, and that the service should be where there are areas of need. The next thing is you want to choose a class that's going to have some representation, some diversity in representation. And when I say diversity, I mean economic, I mean gender, I mean racial, I mean population groups, people who will have an interest in taking care of their own, which means medical school selection. And right now what we're doing is we're selecting only on the basis of, well, not only, that's not true, but we're selecting on the basis of examinations and grades. And you know, there's a lot of experience to suggest that the fact that you get an A+ in organic chemistry does not necessarily make you the best physician, particularly in this system. And the next thing, the last thing probably, is when you teach medical school, you have to teach sensitivity to the use of technology and other aids, and the cost sensitivity. And cost sensitivity is not rationing. Cost sensitivity says, what do you accomplish? How do you decide what the best way to do it? And how do you stay in a position of learning over time?
Great. I think we'll wrap it up. I think we're all going to be available, you know, for drinks and some food. And again, thanks to everybody for coming out tonight.